The rain in Seattle didn't just fall, it interrogated you. It tapped on the glass of Arthur's basement workshop with the persistence of a Morse code operator who refused to sign off. A cold, rhythmic drumming that echoed the dull ache in his lower back. Arthur adjusted his spectacles, the wire rims digging into the bridge of his nose. The scent of burning rosin, ozone, and 40 years of accumulated dust filled his lungs. It was a familiar, comforting smell, a scent he had carried in his clothes since his days at the Naval Institute in 1985. Back then, the world was analog. Back then, they taught him that signals never truly die. They just get tired, lose their amplitude, and hide in the thermal noise. On his workbench, under the harsh glare of a swinging halogen lamp, lay a Zenith transoceanic. It was a beauty from a forgotten era. Chrome dials, leather-wrapped chassis, a map of the world's time zones printed inside the lid. But someone had butchered its guts. The wires were frayed, and the delicate copper coils had been bypassed with modern, surgical precision. "Who did this to you?" Arthur muttered, his voice raspy from decades of cheap coffee and long nights of silence. He wasn't supposed to be curious. At 62, curiosity was a luxury he couldn't afford. He was supposed to fix the tuning dial, clean the contacts, and collect his $50 from the hipster who dropped it off. But as he probed the circuit with a multimeter, he felt a strange resistance, a parasitic drain that shouldn't be there. He bypassed a fried tantalum capacitor, his fingers moving with the haunting muscle memory of a man who could calibrate a sonar array in the pitch-black belly of a submarine. He connected the final lead to the internal speaker. The radio didn't hiss. It didn't crackle with the comforting white noise of the atmosphere. It pulsed. Thump. 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 It was a low-frequency, rhythmic burst, exactly 120 beats per minute. Arthur's eyes shifted to his old oscilloscope, a bulky, green-screen piece of Soviet-era tech he'd kept as a souvenir of his youth. The green phosphor line on the screen didn't just jump, it danced. This wasn't random interference. This wasn't a faulty grounding wire. It was a burst transmission. High speed, heavily compressed, and deadly professional. The kind of signal that carries enough data to start a war or end a life, all packed into a fraction of a second. Arthur glanced at the digital clock on his wall. 02:14 a.m., the dead hour. The frequency on the Zenith dial was shifted into the maritime band, a ghost frequency bouncing off the low, ionospheric clouds of the Pacific Northwest. He grabbed a yellow legal pad and a sharpened pencil. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the radio's pulse. As the pulses hit the processor he'd rigged to the scope, hexadecimal strings began to crawl across his monitor. He didn't need a computer to see the pattern. He'd been decoding signals since the Cold War. 47.6097 north, 122.3331 west. Pioneer Square, Arthur whispered, the words hanging like cold smoke in the damp basement air. Then the Zenith did something it was never designed to do. The amber dial light, a warm vacuum tube glow, flickered and died. In its place, a tiny, hidden LED beneath the glass flared to life. It was a sharp, clinical, terrifying blue. A voice, synthesized and stripped of all human inflection, bled through the speaker. "The circuit is closed, Arthur. Do not look away. Do not go outside." Arthur froze. The hair on the back of his neck stood up like iron filings near a magnet. Slowly, he turned his head toward the small, street-level window of his workshop. The street lamp outside flickered once, twice, and then extinguished. In the sudden, oppressive darkness, the silver sheets of rain became a curtain of ink. Then, a black sedan, matte finish, no chrome, no plates, pulled silently to the curb. No lights, no engine noise. Just a void in the rain. Arthur didn't panic. Panic was a frequency that jammed the brain, and he had spent his life learning how to filter it out. He knew the protocol. He knew that when the lights go out, the predator is already in the room. He moved away from the workbench, sliding into the deep shadows near the furnace. He didn't turn on the lights. Instead, he reached into the crawl space behind a stack of old radio electronics magazines and pulled out a heavy, canvas-wrapped bag. It was his just-in-case kit, a Ghost from 1985. The black sedan remained motionless. He could almost feel them out there, men in tactical gear, checking their optics, mapping the thermal signature of his basement. They were looking for the steady 98.6-degree glow of a human heart. "Looking for a heartbeat," Arthur whispered to the dark. "Let's give you a Ghost instead." He reached into the bag and pulled out a handheld device he'd built from spare microwave magnetrons and a vintage RF generator. He tuned it to the standard encrypted bands used by high-end private security. He flipped the toggle. A faint, teeth-rattling hum vibrated in his palm. On the street, the sedan's side mirrors shifted automatically. Their wireless link had been severed. Their tactical network was suddenly a mess of digital snow. Arthur didn't use the front door. He knew they'd have a sniper covering the porch. He headed for the coal chute, a narrow, rusted relic of the building's 1920s history. He squeezed through, the cold Seattle mud greasing his path, the iron edges scraping his shoulders. He emerged in the alleyway, 3 houses down, just as 2 figures in tactical gray jackets stepped out of the black sedan. They moved with the synchronized, lethal grace of men who were paid very well to make people disappear. He had 5 minutes, maybe less. He reached his old, beat-up Volvo tucked behind a row of overflowing trash bins. He didn't dare start the engine yet. He released the parking brake and let the car roll down the sloped street in neutral, the heavy rain muffling the sound of the tires on the asphalt. As he turned the corner and finally turned the key, he saw a dull flash in his rearview mirror. A small, controlled explosion. They hadn't knocked. They hadn't announced themselves. They had breached his workshop with a thermite charge. Arthur gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the smell of his burning life faint in the distance. The static whisper wasn't just a glitch in an old radio. It was a hunt. And for the first time in 40 years, Arthur was the prey. Arthur kept the Volvo in the shadows of the rain-slicked side streets, steering clear of the main arteries where the city's network of safe city cameras could track his every move. He knew the car was a beacon. Every modern vehicle was a snitch, broadcasting its location to towers he couldn't see. He pulled into a dying shopping mall's parking structure in Queen Anne, a concrete cavern smelling of oil and old exhaust. He needed to scrub his signature. To the cleaners, he was currently a pulsing dot on a digital map. He popped the hood, the engine heat rising in a faint mist against the cold air. They weren't just following his taillights. They were likely pinging his car's onboard diagnostic system, using the cellular link built into the dashboard. "You're checking for bugs?" A voice seemed to echo in his mind, the ghost of his old instructor at the Naval Institute. "No, comrade instructor," Arthur thought. "I'm checking for resonance." He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a small, hand-wound copper coil and a high-voltage capacitor. With the precision of a surgeon, he rigged a shorter across the car's primary fuse box. "If you want to find me," he muttered, "you'll have to listen to the screams." He triggered the device. A localized electromagnetic pulse sizzled through the Volvo's secondary electronics. The infotainment screen flickered, turned a static white, and died. The GPS antenna was now just a piece of useless plastic. To the satellites orbiting 20,000 miles above, the Volvo had just vanished into a cloud of white noise. But he wasn't done. He walked to the mall's rooftop, overlooking the flickering lights of the city. He pulled out a handheld spectrum analyzer, the screen a forest of green peaks representing the invisible life of Seattle. Wi-Fi, 5G, emergency bands, all of them screaming at once. He saw it then, a sharp, narrow spike at 450 megahertz. It was moving, hovering over the neighborhood he'd just left. Drones. A surveillance UAV was circling 1,000 feet up, silent and invisible in the rain. It was likely equipped with a Stingray, a device that mimics a cell tower to force every phone in the area to report its ID. Arthur didn't run. He took a deep breath and opened a rusted maintenance panel on the roof. Inside was a tangle of old copper telephone wires and a heavy-duty signal booster for the mall's internal security. Using a pair of wire strippers, he hijacked the booster's output. He fed the static whisper code, the exact hexadecimal string he'd memorized from the Zenith, directly into the transmitter. "Let's see how you like the taste of your own medicine." He cranked the gain to the maximum. The booster began to whine, radiating a massive, distorted burst of the encrypted data across the entire north end. In an instant, every receiver in a 2-mile radius was flooded with the whisper. The drone's sensors, designed to pick up faint, discrete signals, were suddenly overwhelmed, like a man staring directly into the sun. The UAV's flight controller glitched, its predatory logic confused by the massive feedback loop. Arthur watched the spectrum analyzer. The 450 megahertz spike wavered, dipped, and then began a slow, spiraling descent toward the dark waters of the Sound. He had bought himself an hour. The cleaners would be busy recalibrating their gear, trying to figure out why the entire neighborhood was suddenly screaming in 80s-era naval code. He drove toward Pioneer Square, the heart of the old city. It was a forest of steel and neon, mirrored in the oily puddles of the asphalt. The square sat at the center of a maze, a place where the city's history was buried, literally, beneath the streets. Arthur parked 4 blocks away, tucked between 2 delivery trucks. He left his phone in the glove box, wrapped in layers of industrial tinfoil, a makeshift Faraday cage. The coordinates led to a specific bronze statue in the center of the square. It was a tourist trap by day, but at 3 a.m., it was a graveyard. Arthur sat on a cold stone bench, his coat collar turned up, huddled against the wind. He looked like just another homeless veteran lost in the fog. He pulled a small, modified transistor radio from his pocket, his sniffer. The needle on the signal strength meter began to dance. Someone nearby was broadcasting a low-power Bluetooth signal. It was a digital handshake. It was looking for the Zenith radio that was currently a pile of ash in his workshop. "You're late," a voice murmured. Arthur didn't turn. He recognized the cadence. It was rhythmic, steady, the voice of someone who spent a lot of time reading scripts or lines of code. "The Zenith had a bad transformer," Arthur said, his voice steady. "Took a while to bypass the junk you hid inside it." "You weren't supposed to bypass it, Arthur. You were supposed to deliver it to the drop-off at the pier." "I don't like being lied to," Arthur said, finally turning. The man was younger than he expected. Late 20s, wearing a tech firm hoodie, looking like any other software engineer in a city full of them. No glazał niebo bylistaria. He held a sleek device with an antenna array that suggested it could intercept a satellite link, if needed. "It's not a lie if it's classified," the young man said. "I'm Miller, and you just walked into the middle of a frequency harvest. We're not the only ones listening." Miller looked up at the surrounding skyscrapers, his face pale in the neon light. "The guys in the gray jackets? They're not government. They're cleaners for a telecom conglomerate that's been hijacking the backbone data of the entire West Coast. That Zenith? It contains the decryption keys for the last 10 years of their theft. It's the only physical copy left." Suddenly, the sniffer in Arthur's pocket didn't just dance, it screamed. "Get down!" Arthur lunged at Miller, tackling him just as a silent puff of air hissed past his ear. The stone bench erupted in a spray of granite chips. A suppressed rifle. No muzzle flash, just the sound of a high-velocity impact. "They're on the roof of the parking garage," Arthur hissed, pulling Miller behind the heavy bronze statue. "How many keys do you have left?" "Just the one in my device," Miller gasped, clutching his hardware. "But I have the uploader. If we can get to the central hub in the underground, we can broadcast the keys to every news outlet and federal server in the state. It'll bypass their firewalls from the inside. Arthur looked at the man, then at the dark, padlocked entrance to the Seattle Underground tours across the street. It was a maze of old tunnels, 19th century storefronts buried under the modern city after the Great Fire. A perfect place for a ghost to hide. "I know those tunnels," Arthur said. "I used to map signal dead zones for the city back in the 90s. Follow me and stay low. We're going off the grid." The heavy iron grate of the underground entrance groaned like a dying beast as Arthur forced it open. They slipped into the dark, the air immediately turning thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting timber, and a century of trapped secrets. "Watch your step," Arthur whispered. "The floor is uneven. It's 1890s brickwork down here. If you twist an ankle, I'm leaving you behind." He didn't use a flashlight. He didn't need to. He navigated by the faint, purple-tinted glow of the streetlights, filtering through the skylights embedded in the sidewalks above. Thick glass prisms that looked like glowing amethysts in the ceiling of the tunnels. To the world upstairs, people were just walking on the pavement. To Arthur, those squares of light were a tactical map. Behind them, the grate clattered. The cleaners were inside. "They have night vision," Miller whispered, his breath coming in jagged, panicked hitches. "We're trapped in a basement, Arthur. This is a tomb." "No," Arthur countered, his voice calm, the old naval commander surfacing from the depths of his memory. "Night vision relies on infrared or light amplification. It's a signal, and every signal has a weakness. They see in green and black. We're going to make them see red." Arthur reached into his bag and pulled out a handful of emergency magnesium flare sticks and a roll of industrial reflective tape. As they hurried through a corridor lined with hollowed-out Victorian storefronts, ghostly windows that once held hats and shoes, he stuck strips of tape at eye level on the dusty mannequins leaning against the walls. "When I tell you, shut your eyes, and do not open them until I say." They reached the central hub, a cavernous room where the city's old power lines converged into a modern fiber-optic junction box. The box sat there, glowing with a soft, blue, heartbeat-like LED. This was the throat of the city's data network. "Upload it," Arthur said, pointing to the terminal. Miller scrambled, his hands shaking as he connected his device. "It'll take 3 minutes. The encryption is heavy. It's like trying to push a mountain through a straw." "We don't have 3 minutes." The silhouettes of the two cleaners appeared at the end of the hall. They moved with terrifying efficiency, their suppressed rifles raised. The green glow of their NVG goggles looked like the eyes of predatory insects in the dark. "Now, eyes shut." Arthur struck 3 flares simultaneously. The magnesium flared with the intensity of 1,000 suns. The reflective tape on the mannequins caught the light, bouncing it back in a chaotic, blinding strobe. In the pitch black of the tunnels, the sudden surge of lumens was like a physical blow to the cleaners' retinas. They cried out, tearing the goggles from their faces, but the damage was done. They were effectively blind, wandering in a world of white-hot ghosts. 1 minute, Miller shouted, his fingers flying across the screen. Arthur didn't wait. He knew the cleaners would recover. He grabbed a heavy iron pipe from a pile of debris and struck a nearby pressurized steam valve, a relic of the city's old heating system. The pipes screamed as white vapor hissed into the room, creating a thick, hot shroud that further confused the cleaner's thermal sensors. "Done!" Miller yelled, his voice cracking with relief. "The data is out. It's hitting every federal server and news desk from here to D.C. It's over." "Then we leave," Arthur said, grabbing Miller by the collar. "The back way, the old sewer egress. Move!" The cool air of the Seattle waterfront hit them like a benediction as they emerged near Pier 55. The Puget Sound was churning with dark, cold water, reflecting the first hints of a gray dawn. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Not just police, but federal response units. Miller's upload had triggered a level red cybersecurity alert. The telecom conglomerate's secret was out. Miller leaned against a rusted bollard, gasping for air. "We did it! They're finished! My God, Arthur! You saved everything!" Arthur looked back at the city skyline. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had finally finished a shift that had started back in 1985. "They'll still come for you, Miller," Arthur said softly. "Men like that don't just go to jail. They relocate. They change their names. You need to disappear. Go to the interior, somewhere with no cell towers." "What about you?" Miller asked. Arthur pulled the small sniffer radio from his pocket and looked at it for a moment. Then he tossed it into the dark waters of the Sound. "I was never here," Arthur said. "I'm just a guy who fixes old radios, and the world is getting too digital for my taste anyway." As the gray dawn began to bleed into the sky, Arthur walked toward his Volvo. He had a workshop to clean, a door to repair, and a long, dreamless sleep to catch up on. The static in his head had finally gone silent. On the car radio, a news anchor was already breaking the story of the Seattle data breach. Arthur reached out and turned the knob. He didn't need to listen. He already knew how the signal ended.